Well, thank you, Carolina, and thank you all for having me here. So I don't have any slides, as you can see, which maybe is a bit of a shame because there are some things we could look at, but I'll try to just talk a little bit. I moved to Naples, which is it's a different city, as Carolina says. It's a city that's sort of outside. It's on the margins between the global north and the global south, if you want to use those types of terminologies, right? So it has a lot of elements that you typically would associate with non-European cities. It's a very globalized city, but it's part of a global circuit, which is quite different from the standard global cities, right? So it's maybe more on the network of Tangier and Istanbul and Marseille and cities like that, more than Paris, Frankfurt, London, etc. So it's a different circuit of globalization, and it's an interesting place in that respect because it's a city that is very well inserted in a sort of a different type of global economy and global sociality, which is now reaffirming itself in many ways, right? So we're now, even present geopolitical events, I think, are in a certain sense pointing towards a shift in the balance of power, not only at the state level, but also at the social level, so to say, where these types of circuits that we have for a long time considered to be residual or marginal or underdeveloped or surrounding or southern or whatever term we have wanted to use are now growing in importance across the world, and not just in the south, also in the north, right? In a certain sense of what I'm trying even more thinking is that Naples, but also other places, but since I'm there, Naples is becoming a bit of a paradigm for what you're seeing there is not the residuals of an underdeveloped past, but rather the premonitions of what I call a neo-Plebeian future, in the sense that even in Sweden, I'm from Sweden, but even Sweden has a development now where these types of circuits have been growing a lot in importance and have come to structure also the self-identity of the country to a large extent. So what is this particularity of Naples, and what do I mean by the concept of neo-plebeian, and how does this relate to TikTok and other social media? These are, in a certain sense, the three things that we need to talk about. So in the Italian and the international debates, Naples has always been at the center. In Italy, it's always been at the center of what was known as the Southern question. Right? Even if you read Gramsci in his writings about the Southern, he wasn't the first to write about this, but he was perhaps the person to articulate it in ways that have become most famous. His writings about the Southern questions are very much linked to the topology and the sociology of the city of Naples, right? And the idea then there is that Italian unification was the sort of the fusion of two fairly distinct social topologies, so to say. That on the one hand, you have the center, northern Italy, which was part of the European heartland and central northern European civilization for a long time, and which was also the place where modern capitalism was invented, in a certain sense, right? If you think about the role of the northern Italian city-states, Venice, Florence, Genova, etc., as pioneers of a whole city. And then on the other hand, you have the southern part, which remained fairly solidly rooted in a fairly sort of static feudal economy, right? Particularly in the countryside, the commercialization of agriculture was very slow. You had a very strong and lasting feudal economy in the countryside, and which was also linked. Naples became linked to the Spanish Empire, right? So in the late 15th century, early early 16th century, the 1500s, Naples enters into the Spanish Empire as the second most important city. And as you know, the Spanish Empire owed its wealth to the plunder of South America and became like a vehicle of the introduction of a whole series of wealth that was extracted, particularly in the form of silver from the South American silver mines. But this type of injection of wealth never really fueled much of an economic and social modernization within the Spanish Empire. It was rather sort of shipped towards the northern Europe, where it was part of an earlier industrialization process, etc. So in that sense, the Spanish Empire remained very much the capital of 17th century Baroque civilization, in a sense, right? So you have a situation where you get a consolidation of, or you get even something that a lot of people now call re-feudalization, right? So in a certain sense, you get like a turn back to an economy and a society that has very, very strong feudal characteristics, right? So made up by a small number of small and very wealthy elite, which governs a large and very, very destitute urban or rural population, also through clientelistic and sort of personal networks in different ways. So, and this was particularly strengthened then in the 17th and 18th century, because the process of re-feudalization, of granting feudal titles to a number of merchants and courtiers, etc., re-established the feudal system structure of the countryside around the city of Naples, and also brought in an enormous migration to the city. Right? So the city's basically tripled in size during the 17th century. And you've got a very particular sociology of the city, which was sort of oriented around, on the one hand, a small, wealthy elite inhabiting large palaces in the city center, and then an enormous mass of sort of destitute poor sleeping on the streets and sort of serving the needs of this urban elite. Right? The people that then were referred to most famously, perhaps, like by Goethe in the late 18th century as the Lazzaroni. Right? And Goethe's sort of characterization of the Lazzaroni was that not only were they poor and destitute, but they had really no desire for self-improvement. They had no desire for modernity in a certain sense, right? But they were sort of quite content of dwelling in this type of condition of an eternal present, in a certain sense. Also because the particular economy of Naples at the time made it possible to actually live a pretty good life, even if you were poor. It became like a sort of a paradise for the poor, because the city is situated within a very fertile agricultural economy, where there is a lot of fruit and vegetables that are being produced, but there's not much of a transportation system, so these needs to be consumed during the day. So you have a very cheap access to these basic foodstuffs. The sea is rich with fish, etc., etc. So it's sort of possible to sort of make do in this type of condition. Right? So, and that became then, in a certain sense, the stereotype of Naples for a whole series of travelers, right, during the 19th, 18th, and particularly 19th century, particularly Northern European travels who came there as part of what was known as the Grand Tour, right? The Grand Tour, which was what an educated Northern European, particularly English, nobleman or wealthy person would do as a part of a sort of a coming of age process, would generally end in the city of Naples, where they would sort of marvel at this combination between the remains of Roman ruins and this sort of massive spectacle of urban poverty, etc. So, in that sense, Naples was always represented as the quintessential plebeian city, or at least since the famous rebellion in 1647, where this urban underclass sort of rioted and took over the city for a couple of months, and then they were sort of put down again by the Spanish military as a result of the taxation of the fruit and vegetable market. So this type of imposition of taxes on these abundant resources, which were previously almost free, created this sort of violent popular uprising where the houses of merchants and noble people were burned down and people were massacred in the street. And it was led by this fisherman called Masaniello, who became like the governor of the city for a couple of months, and was invited to the palace of the viceroy and covered in gold, and came back to his neighborhood in his new golden clothes, and sort of had this sort of charismatic leadership of the plebs for some weeks, and then was assassinated, and sort of order was restored again. So, and after that type of rebellion, Masaniello and Naples came to stand for this category, which became very, very important in early modern political thinking, which was the category of the plebeian. Right? Because, of course, the types of developments that the city of Naples went through in the 16th and 17th century were also the types of development that happened in northern European cities. In the sense, London had the same type of development, and the enclosures movements in the countryside were moving a lot of people that were unemployed and destitute and poor into the city. And starting in the 17th century, these became the object of a whole series of preoccupations. Right? What are we going to do with this new plebs, as they were called, right? This urban mass of people who don't have a job, who don't have an occupation, who don't have enough to eat, who tend to resort into prostitution and criminality and petty theft, who are a source of often violent uprisings and rebellions, riots that don't seem to have any rationality to them, but are provoked by sort of events, etc., unpredictable, etc. And a lot of the responses to this, of course, became that of the development of things like the modern police system, the deportation systems, right? A lot of the people were sent over to the Americas as indentured servants. They were sent later in the UK to Australia in the late 18th and 19th century. Within the Spanish Empire, they were sent to South America in the so-called forzado system, whereby people who had committed petty crimes, often petty theft or prostitution, could be forcibly moved over to the colonies, right? And they became also a lot of, in a certain sense, the stepping stone for a lot of the development of both modern social theory and also modern forms of what Michel Foucault calls governance, right, or governmentality, right? The idea, these urban plebs, in a certain sense, became like the trigger for a process whereby people entered into political theory as a problem, which was sort of new, right? Because in the medieval political theory, they hadn't really constituted much of a problem at all, right? So, and this process was then sort of resolved, right, within quotation marks, in Northern Europe and in the United Kingdom by industrialization, right? Because, of course, along with the original accumulation, primitive accumulation process, the presence of this type of large surplus population, so to say, right, were fundamental conditions for the industrialization process. And within the industrialization process, there was also sort of a transformation of these urban plebs into a proletariat, right? Which is, of course, a process that has been described very thoroughly by a whole tradition of mostly English historiography, right? Starting with E.P. Thompson and the various followers. E.P. Thompson wrote a famous article in the early 70s called Patrician Society, Plebeian Culture, whereby he describes 18th century England as being essentially structured in terms of a society made up of the nobility, wealthy merchants, courtiers, and some other people like that, and then a vast sort of plebeian universe of people following basically unknown and more often reprehensible oral traditions that sort of lose themselves in time. Right? And this type of plebs then is being transformed by industrialization on the one hand, but by the stick of factory discipline and the carrot of consumer culture, so to say, transformed into a modern proletariat. Right? This process doesn't really happen in Naples. Right? In Naples is a situation where this wave of sort of transformation of the plebs into a proletariat in the 18th and 19th century occurs only marginally or sporadically. Right? But instead there is a consolidation of a very strong plebeian social bloc in the city, which is also aided by the cholera epidemics in the 19th century, whereby most of the patrician families are moving out from the city center. Cholera epidemics that killed off perhaps 10% of the city's population in a couple of years, which is quite astonishing. COVID killed about 1 promille of the global population, I think, so much more severe in that sense. Which meant, of course, anybody who could fled out of this, and then you got like an occupation of these old noble palaces by these plebeian families, which constituted a very sort of strong plebeian social bloc in the city that to a large extent developed their own institutions, both economic institutions in terms of informal economies, market exchange, counterfeit, smuggling, well, counterfeit not yet, but counterband and smuggling and things like that, and also their own political institutions, what later evolved into organized crime organizations as the famous Camorra, which is the Napolitanian mafia, which is basically running the city in collaboration, of course, with local elites and other actors, which of course not entirely, but which is a strong sort of, there's a sort of a strong plebeian social bloc which has managed to remain, not unaltered of course, and we'll come back to that, but remain sort of fairly powerful in structuring in giving a character to the structure and also the popular culture of the city, which has also become then what has been moved out into the suburbs and the peripheries, particularly in the wake of the earthquakes in the early 80s that destroyed parts of the historical center and led to the construction of new peripheries, etc. So this type of particular social characteristics of the city then made it a representative of this this idea of an ungovernable, impossible to modernize, impossible to include within a modern rational project, right? And the original meaning also of the term plebs, which was used also, Gramsci also used it to talk about this Napolitanian population, is of course that that part of the population that cannot be included in the people. And so the original Roman term, the plebs in archaic Rome, were the part of the population that cannot serve in the army, and that are excluded from the classes, the ordines of the Roman society. And then, of course, a lot of Republican Roman history is about the attempts by the plebs to enter into the people, etc., which they managed to do successfully after a while. But the original meaning, and this original meaning was also then maintained when the political category of the plebs is discovered in early modernity. So when in the 17th century, people like Baudin, etc., start to discuss the idea of the plebs, the idea of the plebs is always as people it's an outside that is inside. Right? Something that is outside of society but physically present within society, and that cannot be metabolized in a certain sense within the modern project. So also Hegel, who talks about the Pöbel, right? The Pöbel for Hegel, which then lately translate into Lumpenproletariat for Marx, right? Is this type of fundamental contradiction in Hegel, the thing that can't really be dissolved by the dialectic, right? The Pöbel is this irreducible element which is inside society but can never be absorbed because it's characterized by a fundamental negativity, by a fundamental hatred of the state, you know, and a refusal to sort of be part of this. So why is this interesting? Well, because I've run in lately to this concept of the neo-plebeian, right? So the neo-plebeian, not the old plebe, but the new plebe, right? And it's a concept that, as far as I know, was launched by two Italian demographers, and I think also a bit unwittingly, without really taking seriously the history of the concept, so to say. But what they meant by neo-plebeian was essentially that we now have a process whereby a lot of people across the globe, right? A lot of people are being, who have been sucked into modernity and wage labor in the last couple of generations, are being spit out again, in a sense, right? So you have a situation whereby people who have been maybe born into situations where the idea that you can get a job, that you can buy a house, that you can have a career, that you can go on vacation, that you could, were sort of self-evident, but then the actual developments of the labor market, of the education system, of the housing market, etc., means that they can't really satisfy them, right? And they're being sort of ejected into a condition of permanent precarity, so to say, right? And a situation that is also strengthened by current tendencies of neo-feudalization, right? Because just like in the 17th century, you have a sort of a strengthening of the feudal character of society with the re-establishment of this new type of very, very wealthy elites. You could also say that today you have a process of neo-feudalization by means of which inequalities are growing very, very quickly, and you have the establishment of a mostly financial elite that is very remote from the concerns of ordinary people and very, very unaccountable in relation to its actions, right? So in that sense, you could say that structurally you have a tendency whereby the type of plebeian characteristics that have been preserved in different ways in places like Naples, but also many other places like that, right, are now being transformed into a sort of global norm through these developments that we can call financialization, neoliberalism, post-Fordism, whatever you want to call it, right? There are even people now who, like Varoufakis, the former Greek prime minister, finance minister, who is explicitly talking about techno-feudalism, right? A situation whereby the world is run by a small number of very, very mighty and unaccountable actors, mainly through their links to the tech industry and the control of digital companies, etc. And on the other hand, then you have a proliferation of what Abu Malik Simon calls the urban surrounds, right? All these type of disconnected people that move around and that are pushed from the countryside into the big cities because of enclosures movement, because of the commercialization of agriculture, etc., and who once in the big cities are no longer, but are not like integrated within the type of the formal labor market and the wage relation. In ways very similar to what occurred in Naples and other big cities in the early modern epoch. Right? So that's what we mean a little bit by neo-plebeian. So, how does this thing relate to TikTok then, to TikTok and to digital media? Well, TikTok and a number of related platforms, mostly of Chinese origins, like Temu and AliExpress and a couple of others, are a part of a Chinese digital trajectory, right? A digital trajectory that is shaped by different type of conditions, both in terms of different sociological conditions, in terms of a different market for these types of apps, but also in different economic conditions, a different type of monetization system, but also perhaps more importantly, different political conditions, in the sense that a different imperative from above on the part of the Chinese state as to what digital media should be for and what they should be useful for, in a sense. The outcome of these factors has been to create a generation of digital apps that are very, very geared towards diffuse popular participation, right? So if the Silicon Valley social media apps like Instagram and Facebook to some extent, but mostly Instagram, were continuing and replicating a celebrity logic that in a certain sense came from the old Hollywood system, right? And translated into imperatives for self-branding, which Carolina has written a lot about, etc. And thereby preserve this idea of personal uniqueness, right? Of reputational capital as embodied in the crafted and branded persona, right? Which was also inscribed in their algorithms because they were based on this social graph algorithm, which meant that your influential capital was consolidated in your follower networks, etc. TikTok has a completely different set of affordances, right? And a completely different way of creating the conditions for success and influence or virality or whatever you want to call it on social media, right? It is much, much less about the person and its qualities. I mean, there are, of course, famous people on TikTok as well, but for most people, it is less about building a personal brand and more about the ability of being in touch with the latest trend and what is evolving locally or within your community of interest, etc. Right? So it tends to be much more populist in the sense that it's easier for people to sort of to make it, in a sense, right? But in the same time, and it tends to favor content that is local and momentarily and trending and so on. And at the same time, it is much less unstable in the sense that it institutionalizes a sort of constant precarity that the Instagram system really did not, because at Instagram, once you have a large network of followers, your reputational capital is pretty secure. But as a lot of our interviews says on TikTok, you never really know if you're going to be around tomorrow as well, right? So it has this, and it's shown in the city of Naples. It's shown a very, very close fit to this type of remaining plebeian social structures, in the sense that a lot of these informal economic activities have made use of TikTok to sort of transition into a new type of digital economy, right? So you've got an enormous proliferation of street vendors ranting in dialect on TikTok and showcasing a lot of their sort of popular vernacular virtuosity in speaking, singing, and dancing, etc. You have a lot of small family businesses that are emerging on TikTok. You have a lot of people in the informal and illegal economy that are making a lot of use on TikTok. Everything from the criminal organizations that are now using TikTok as a way of sort of showing off or challenging each other or paying homage to someone or filming a TikTok video when someone gets out of prison and and everybody's celebrating, etc. You have a lot of the informal, the counterfeit economy, which used to be very much located in street markets and still is, but a lot of these street vendors are now selling counterfeits on TikTok, live streams on TikTok, and are getting customers not only in the city but also in the rest of Italy and even in Northern Europe. You have a lot of use of TikTok on the part of the traditional popular music scene. So Naples have had, for a long time, been one of the few cities in Europe that even in the 80s and 90s had a localized popular music scene, right? So something that is known as neomelodico, which is a sort of a take on the Italian popular song, but with a different type of sort of Arabic tonality or Turkesque tonality in a sense, which developed in the 1970s, 1980s as the particular sound of the sort of plebeian city, and very quickly got integrated into the organized crime system, because these singers became like championed by local crime bosses, and they were, you know, paid to perform at weddings and family parties, and the local crime bosses were financing concerts, etc., and became distributed in the 80s and 90s to a large extent through the practice of counterfeit cassettes, right? So they were registered there were these entrepreneurs. There's a very nice film about it. It's on Netflix, I think, called Mixed by Arri, which traces this history of two brothers who are launching this counterfeit music business and using the networks of counterfeit cigarette vendors, because selling counterfeit cigarettes has been a very important source for sustenance and living for the plebeian classes in Naples ever since the post-war years. And even now there's a permanent presence of mostly old women selling counterfeit cigarettes on the streets. But that stuff was sort of repressed a bit in the 1980s, so these cassette networks then used the counterfeit cigarette vendors as distribution networks, etc. And they were counterfeiting official music tapes. In fact, these two brothers arrived at becoming the largest music distributor in Italy at some point before they triggered the attention of the forze dell'ordine, as you say in Italian, the police, right? Who usually tend to ignore these things, because the police has constantly ignored the smuggled cigarette business, because it's also a source of sustenance for many people, and really repressing it would create a large rebellion, right? So this neo-melodico scene then has now also taken on TikTok and got mixed also with influences from rap and trap, etc., and generated also sort of local versions of street fashion, which in turn tend to circulate a lot around the counterfeit markets, right? So you have this expression, dupe culture, which you might have heard about, right? A lot of people who are preferring to buy sort of high quality counterfeits, very much knowing that they're not the real thing, but that they will last anyways. And so there is an interaction whereby sort of local neo-melodico stars are launching local fashion trends, which are revolving around these particular brands, which are then being imported as counterfeits and sold in these type of street markets, etc. Right? So there's a very strong empowerment around this, which to some extent is also, of course, linked to this very new boom in tourism. As you know, Naples has become a very popular tourism destination, and I think the number of tourist arrivals has quadrupled since 2019, from 3 to 12 million people a year, which is becoming unsustainable. But of course, this has pushed a lot of new money into this. So there's a lot of these type of plebeian entrepreneurs who have established themselves on TikTok and then become also popular among tourists and begin to earn a lot of money, and then get sponsored often by some organized crime figures to launch their own restaurants, their own bars, or their own brands, etc. Because also, of course, the tourist economy to a large extent is about recycling money from organized crime as well, right? So, so there is this type of network. So what is the sort of, what's the point of all this? Well, I think maybe what you could say is that, or perhaps that, the distinctive element of this type of neo-plebeian condition is that the neo-plebe, so to say, as opposed to the old early modern plebs, is not simply residual from pre-modernity, but is something that has sort of passed through modernity, so to say, right? Being sucked in and then spat out again, and spat out in a condition of structural precarity, but still included by there via media and consumer culture, right? So consumer culture is something that still remains as a unifying element for this type of global neo-Plebeian, which is of course not just present in Naples, but also in the peripheries of Manchester or Stockholm or Bombay or wherever, right? Wherever, in fact, right? Because on the one hand, of course, the mere presence, right? I mean, today we have 5 billion smartphones distributed around the world, so everybody knows what the latest Gucci sweater looks like or the latest Adidas tracksuit looks like, and everybody desires it, right? This is a type of desire which is beyond question, right? It's obvious that these are desirable objects, right? There was this story by a journalist in the Gaza Strip who ran into one of these, a young guy who was walking around with a machine gun, a 12, 13-year-old or something like that, who looked at his Adidas sneakers and said, yeah, wow, those are cool Adidas sneakers, right? So that was the sort of the reaction what was to that, right? That was like, in a certain sense, the commons of this neo-plebeian condition is these type of branded streetwear, right? Or branded fashions, which have transitioned from being well, they have also, of course, been developed in relation to this, right? Because if you look at the ways in which tracksuits and sneakers have become fashion elements, has been very much about appropriating the cultural expressions of this type of neo-plebe, particularly in the United States, where, of course, the Afro-American experience can be understood as perhaps one of the most first manifestations of modern neo-plebeization, right? Black migrants from the South in the 1920s go up to the industrial cities in the North and pass a generation as being included within the wage system as factory laborers, but then starting to get like ejected again in the 1960s when you have the first tendencies of post-Fordist restructuring within particularly the American auto industry, where you can see the growth of the black ghettos of Chicago and Detroit, etc., right? Already in the late 60s, early 70s, and the establishment there also of this type of particularly what then becomes known as inner city culture in the United States, right? Which then become a source of inspiration for sports manufacturers like Adidas, Nike, etc., who sell these types of garments at particularly directed at this type of market, knowing very well that it is a sort of a source of a particular type of coolness that can then be sold on also to wealthier middle-class consumers. Right? So this is a bit of a new project for me. I've been doing some empirical research on this type of new social media culture in Naples, which I'm going to talk more about in the second talk that comes up. But this empirical research has been started me thinking about whether one could sort of resuscitate and recover this concept of the plebeian or the neo-plebeian as a container for a whole series of developments that are described in a broad variety of different terms. And the point would be then perhaps that the neo-plebeian would be understood as, on the one hand, this movement of absorption and then ejection, but then on the other hand also at the same time new forms of recomposition which are happening primarily through media and consumer culture, and the sort of the outcomes of which I don't think we can really see yet, which are forms of recomposition that I don't think have yet reached sort of the political stage, right? That are more in the stage of what Joshua Clover describes as that of riots, right? But riots articulated within this sort of global language of consumer culture. Yes, thank you.